Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. Now, the past couple episodes have been very focused on American campaigns and this phenomenon of influencers/creators, but as promised, we're going to move to the other side of the Atlantic in this episode and look at what's happening on the cutting edge of academic research when it comes to social media and politics in the EU. And my guest is Professor Ulrike Klinger. She is a professor for digital democracy at the European New School of Digital Studies, European University Viadrina. And if you're a longtime listener, you've already heard a bit about Professor Klinger's research in episode 65 with Professor Jakob Svensson on new media logics and algorithmic agency. But in this episode, we're going to cover two of Professor Klinger's recent studies. One looks at party communication in European Parliament elections to see whether this is getting more negative over time. And the other looks at a more bottom-up approach of how extremist ideas start on one platform, migrate across multiple platforms, and eventually get laundered into mainstream press. And uniting both of these studies is a theoretical focus on dissonant public spheres, which is the theme of a new special issue in the Journal of Political Communication entitled Digital Campaigning in Dissonant Public Spheres, where Professor Klinger is one of the editors. And the idea behind dissonant public spheres, we'll get more into it in the episode, is essentially the idea that a Habermasian public sphere, as traditionally understood, which seeks to encourage rational debate and consensus seeking, is not quite fit for purpose in the digital age, where we have a lot of non-rational, conflict-oriented debate fragmented across multiple platforms. So there's a dissonance in the communication rather than a sort of consonance towards a surveillance check on the state as per Habermasian original theory. So it's sort of a revision of how to think about public spheres. And both the study on European party communication as well as this laundering of extremist ideas, both are arguably examples of that dissonance in modern day discourse enabled by the fragmentation of digital platforms. So there'll be links to all these resources in the episode description, but let me just run through the names of the studies that we'll be discussing today. The first is Are Campaigns Getting Uglier and Who is to Blame? Negativity, Dramatization, and Populism on Facebook in the 2014 and 2019 European Parliament election campaigns. That is published in Political Communication. And then the second study we'll discuss is entitled From the Fringes into Mainstream Politics: Intermediary Networks and Movement Party Coordination of a Global Anti-Immigration Campaign in Germany, published in Information, Communication, and Society. So Professor Klinger is lead author on both of those studies, and then towards the end of the episode, we'll also get into a discussion around data access, because the European Commission, in drafting this Digital Services Act, is asking for researcher input on what types of data they need and what types of data might be feasible to obtain from platforms through regulation. And these discussions are really timely and important given that Twitter has finally closed access to its academic API, meaning that there's very few data streams left for researchers to study what's happening in public spaces on social media as we have big elections coming up in both the European Union and the United States. So Professor Klinger, together with Dr. Jakob Ohme, have published a paper that responds to the Commission's request for input on how the Commission may be able to regulate platforms and provide data to researchers. There'll be a link to that paper in the episode description. So all in all, we cover a lot of ground in this episode, not so much time to go fully in depth. So do feel free to check out the full studies down in the show notes. And I should note that Professor Klinger and I were able to get together in person during a conference focusing on responsible citizenship and promoting the launch of the Political Communication Special Issue. So big thanks to Professor Karolina Koszmasielska for letting us use the rooms at Audencia Business School. For me, it's always much more fun to record these interviews in person, and hopefully that comes through in the conversation. So, without further ado, let me turn it over to my guest, Professor Ulrike Klinger. Again, she is a professor for digital democracy at the European New School of Digital Studies, European University Viadrina. Professor Klinger, thanks for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So both of the studies that we'll discuss today speak to an idea called dissonant public spheres, which is argued to characterize a political discourse that lacks arguments, rationality, and consensus seeking in politics. Can you set the stage a bit here and explain what is meant by dissonant public spheres, and how might it differ from previous concepts that our listeners might know, like filter bubbles, for example?
Yeah, it's a concept that I really appreciate and like a lot. It basically goes back to Lance Bennett and Barbara Pfetsch's article on disrupted public spheres, and then Barbara later developed it into dissonant public spheres. And the basic idea is that much of what we think about public spheres from the classic orthodox theory is just wishful thinking. Barbara Pfetsch's word, not mine. Public sphere is good, it's rational, it's deliberation, but that's not actually what we see in the reality on platforms these days. So actually, when you study platforms and what's going on there, this orthodox classic theory is not very helpful. And dissonant public spheres basically is a concept that takes into account all those things that, this hellhole of toxicity, of hate speech, of disinformation, of yelling at each other, but not listening to each other, and all those things that are happening that we're studying all the time that just do not lead to the outcomes that we would expect from classic public sphere theory. So this is basically why we use this concept when we're studying things like negative campaigning and these things, because you suddenly get to address the more negative collateral effects of platforms, if you will. But it's different from the filter bubbles. When we talk about filter bubbles, if Axel Bruns is listening to this episode, he's really going to roll his eyes at us. So it's more a macro level theory, talking about the whole of society and of public sphere, not so much about individual citizens or groups that might experience or not experience some kind of locked-in syndrome.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, when it comes to elections and campaigns, that's when a lot of this negativity can come out as parties are trying to persuade voters. So to probe this notion of dissonance, you and your colleagues conducted a 12-country study of political parties' Facebook posts across not one, but two European Parliament elections. So before we dive into the specifics of that study, can you tell us about what variables you were interested in studying within this mass of data and how they relate to your arguments about dissonant public spheres?
Yeah, but before I do that, I have to, of course, mention my brilliant co-authors, Karolina Kotz-Michalska and Uta Russmann, who contributed to this study as much as I did. Yeah, and you mentioned we compared 12 countries in the European elections 2014 and 2019, and that means 10 languages. And, it's perhaps just a footnote, but I think this is something that hardly ever gets appreciated, especially with American colleagues who just don't face this kind of problems. Because if you do a content analysis with such large number of countries and languages, you need coders who really speak those languages and who know the context of their countries and of their cultures. Like we coded personalization also, for instance. And could you identify 10 Dutch politicians? Or 5 Belgian celebrities, if you saw them in a post?
No, and I can say from where I've experienced some problems with this in coders is if politicians, for example, are mentioning their wives or partners or dogs, you have to know the content to know how to code that.
Yeah, exactly. Also to know if somebody is cynical, if there's just irony, if something is an attack message or just a joke, you really need to know context. So that was really challenging, but we did it anyway. Because the EU elections are just such a great opportunity to do comparative studies. And on negative campaigning, negative emotions and all these things, a lot of work has been done across countries, but not so much across time, or either just the countries or time. So we wanted to combine this in this study. And for this paper, we focused on negative campaigning, negative emotions. So we split the two. Very often they're just clumped together in one variable, but there are posts that kind of carry negative emotions but not be negative campaigning. Dramatization and populist content. Yeah, so basically we wanted to know if parties are participating in this game of negativity and if they do increasingly so.
So how then are you going about thinking of negative campaigning? What is a negative campaign post? Because you mentioned they're different, or they can be different from negative emotions.
So we separated the two because a post can evoke negative emotions. For instance, about migration, you can say now all the migrants are coming, it's the end of our welfare system. So that can evoke anger or fear, and it's a negative emotion. But negative campaigning in a more narrow sense would be messages that don't campaign on the message, vote for us, we are great, we're going to solve the problems, but is campaigning saying, don't vote for the others because they're really bad. So kind of attacking the opponent, painting them as the enemy, instead of really giving positive messages about what's good about your campaign and your program.
Mm. And one of the questions I had with the study, and I've seen a couple other studies doing this as well, focusing on European Parliament elections or even national elections, why focus on party communication on Facebook? And one of the reasons I'm curious is that what I think about, what I've seen in terms of party communication is it tends to be quite standardized, quite boring. And I wonder, when these parties have accounts on social media, do you expect them to be, for example, more negative because they're trying to kind of fit the norms of the platform? Or perhaps for our US listeners, is it such that party communication is just much more prominent in Europe? Because you don't often think about the Democrat or the Republican Party, posting so much. So I'm just curious to get your thoughts on party communication and how that would relate to negativity.
So we already had over 100 parties in this sample to study. So it's a parliament of, I think, 705 seats. So if we had focused on the candidates, I can't even give you a number how much that would have been, but it would have been huge. So that's the practical side here. But also, parties are still the primary actors in campaigning, particularly in Europe. European countries tend to be very much party-centered political systems. Also, I think parties are an interesting actor to focus on with these questions of negativity in public spheres, because parties can be regulated. There are provisions for how to campaign, party financing, there are laws, and there are softer ways to regulate, like the codes of conduct that we've seen, for instance, in the Netherlands, where parties agree on what's okay in campaigning and what's not okay. So it's easier to do that with parties and to see, okay, how are they behaving in elections? Are they really doing everything that's possible that they could do to maximize visibility, or are there some kind of code of conduct or something that they adhere to? And there's lots of ideological diversity within parties. We have incumbent parties and challenger parties. So I don't think that's boring, actually.
No, I meant more like, and I was looking a little bit into this. I don't know how well of a theory it is, but there's an idea called party institutionalism, which is the idea that parties are constrained in how flexible they can be because they are kind of institutions. But I want to pick up on something you said about parties having different rules and they can sort of be regulated differently across Europe. One thing I learned from this study was that France bans negative campaigning.
Yeah, there are different rules in all the countries, also until what day you can post, for instance, before an election. And so there are stricter rules in France about campaigning and what is okay in campaigning. And that's something you can study if you focus on parties, but if you would focus on candidates. Also because, as you said, it's more institutionalized. So, parties don't just post something after they had a bottle of wine or something, right? So there is usually a whole team behind that kind of crafts these posts, and there is some reasoning behind it. You can really think that there are, deliberately posted, and there are more people thinking about how they relate to the overall campaign message and these things. And that's not always true for candidates and competitors.
So you were looking at these 4 variables: negative campaigning, negative emotions, dramatization, and populism. And you coded posts from over 100 parties, 12 countries in the 2014 and 2019 EP elections. So in addition to observing changes in these content variables over time, you also want to see how they related to attracting user engagement on Facebook in the form of likes, comments, and shares. So what were the key top-line findings that came out of the analysis?
The most interesting finding is that platforms, or the algorithmic system behind platforms, reward negativity, drama, and to some degree populism. The results were not so clear for populism. So parties actually get more likes and shares or more comments for those negative postings. It means it makes sense for them to do that if they optimize their messages for maximum visibility, which is, of course, what you would do during an election campaign. So it's not something that happens accidentally or just because, parties get more grumpy over time, but it's strategically, it makes perfect sense. Whether we like it or not, and whether it's good for democracy or that's morally okay, strategically, as things are, it absolutely makes sense. And of course, there are limits to how we can explain why that is. So we do know from internal papers, reports that leaked from Facebook and Meta. We know so much only from those leaks because we cannot properly study it. But we know that, the platform is built on this measure of meaningful social interaction. And obviously, some interactions drive this more than others. So Facebook gives an angry reaction 5 times the weight than they attribute to a regular like. And that, of course, drives anger and fear on the platform. So it's really good for their business model. It really makes them a lot of money. But it also means that you benefit from those messages that are styled in that way. And parties are doing this. And we also know from internal reports that a lot of European parties in 2019 have complained to Facebook about this because they somehow noticed that they're more successful with these attack messages, and they complained that this is not what they want to do. But if they don't do it, of course they fall behind those parties who are not so sensitive and who go all in for attack messages. So they complained, saying you incentivize us to communicate in this aggressive style, which is actually nothing we want to do. This is not the way we want to communicate with citizens and voters. So that's, I think, the most interesting takeaway, and that it's not just the usual suspects anymore who go negative. Of course, nationalist parties, far-right parties, populist parties, they are super negative. They've always been, and there was no change in those 2 years. But now it's also conservative parties, for instance, who kind of adopt this style because they benefit from it.
Yeah, and it's interesting, going back to this question of parties. I mean, one thing that European parties, as far as I know, don't really have is access to these type of super PACs that you have in the States, where you can have these outside organizations doing the negative campaigning for you, whereas the candidate profiles, for example, are only posting mostly positive stuff. We see that in the findings in the US. So I think it's interesting. In Europe, they don't have this kind of outlet of external groups to go negative. So maybe that's part of the reasons why they feel they have to complain, because there's no other way they can do it.
Well, they increasingly do have those kind of, surrogate organizations or networks around them who could basically do this. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a very different setup compared to the US.
Yeah, this idea of surrogates and sort of, large scale US campaigns and European campaigns is an interesting one. And in particular, I mean, one of the things I really loved about this study is you get this macro high level look of like what's going on across Europe. That is kind of something that only a European Parliament election can bring. But then I was also thinking, there's so much diversity across Europe, and a lot has changed on Facebook between 2014 and 2019. So just at the level of kind of like research design, what are some of the strengths and weaknesses at taking, such a high level look at these elections and the kind of content of Facebook posts? Because you find that negative campaigning increased from 5% to 7% across the 2 time periods. And I'm just wondering, if you have so much data, is that 2% problematic because of the size of the data? Or could it be that some renegade parties in 2019 go crazy negative and that kind of pushes the aggregate numbers up? So I'm just curious to get your thoughts about this kind of large look at these European Parliament elections. What are kind of the strengths and weaknesses of that approach?
Yeah, I mean, those European elections are really an invitation for, cross-country comparison, because those countries are so different with their party systems, political systems, and so forth, that it's really hard to compare them on the national level. But for European Parliament elections, they are all campaigning according to the same rules at the same time. And it's not the European parties really who do the campaigning, it's still the national parties. So yeah, it's second level elections, not as important as national elections, but because the national parties are campaigning, they get a lot of coverage and visibility and these things. And I think the advantage of really looking at, we looked at 12 countries, but we could look at all of them if we had more resources or automated more things in the analysis, is that sometimes you jump to conclusions when you look at one country or 2 countries. you see a lot more negativity in country A and country B, but not in the others. So it's kind of leveling out those effects. So I think this is really a strength of this broader look. Now, yeah, you can say overall, we found this increase by 2%. We could dive in deeper in the countries and to see, where are some interesting patterns. We haven't done that yet. So kind of doing more large level empirically informed case studies or something. That's something we could absolutely do. And perhaps we will and write more papers out of this data set that also contains a lot more variables than those reported in that paper. But I think the interesting thing here is not the 2% increase, but that it's not the renegade parties whom you would expect to go all negative and to attack and all that, but that we can see across countries that it's other parties, it's conservative parties most visibly, that adopt this campaign strategy as well. You also see the Green parties are using more dramatization, but I think that's also an effect of them talking not about climate change anymore, but about the climate crisis, and environmental issue were a big topic in the 2019 campaigns. So I think it's not about the 2%, but who is driving negativity, and it's not the renegade parties anymore. Also, perhaps I should add that negative campaigning is not always bad. Sometimes you really have to go negative. Like, how would you expose corruption, for instance, if there's a corrupt party? I mean, that is negative campaigning by saying, oh, look how corrupt they are. Don't vote for them. So it's not always bad. It's not always a problem. But I think we have a problem if algorithmic systems of platforms that have become major social spaces for campaigning incentivize parties to go more negative. I mean, if they decide to run a negative campaign, so be it, and sometimes they have to, but they shouldn't be incentivized to do so to gain more visibility and interactions with their target groups.
Definitely. And thinking about this idea that the Facebook algorithms, they weight anger more than other emotions, and this may incentivize parties to go negative. What's the alternative scenario in the sense that if the technological environment was different, would we assume that parties would be more technocratic and constructive with one another? Or is that just too high an expectation, that voters just expect things to be controversial? I think many of them kind of want to see politics as a battle, especially if they're more partisan. So I'm just kind of thinking of the other side of the argument, which would be maybe it's not the platform. Or what are your thoughts? Do you think it's the platform that they're catering to? Or is it that people just aren't interested in the ins and outs of hardcore policy and parties just need to act out to stay relevant?
That's a really good question, because it links back to the very old question that we've been studying in Polcom for so long, is the question of party logics versus media logics. So we've had this debate for years and under the rubric of mediatization and all that. So do parties leave their party logics, like campaigning of, just messaging what is important to them, what their platform is, what they want, and what makes sense for them as a party? Or do they adapt and adopt the logics of the media, which they have done with mass media for a long time? And perhaps we could say they are now adapting more to network media logic or platform logic or whatever we call it. So that's actually an old question. And I think it pretty much depends on the party. But that's a very normative argument. It should be the choice of a party, how they do this, like what in this gradual game, how much they stick with party logics or they totally submit or exploit what algorithms offer them. It's an offer to say, if you go really negative and attack, you're gonna be very visible. Like social media is really gonna work for you. If that's not your style, well, perhaps, you're not gonna be super successful on social media. Because we have to keep in mind campaigning does not only happen on platforms. I mean, we study this. I do. So, I tend to focus on this a lot. But we see that those parties who are super successful on social media, because they're very aggressive and negative, perhaps, tend not to be the most successful parties in the election. So there is still mass media in the game. There is still personal contacts. There is still, people knocking on doors, canvassing, meeting people on the marketplaces and all that. And of course, voters, they do have their socialization. They have very stable attitudes and all that. So parties also face the situation that their campaign message must be somehow consistent across all these channels and outlets. So if they go super, super negative, they will kind of have to reflect that in personal discussions with voters and on mass media. So this is something that I think we have to keep in mind here. And I don't think that if the platforms would change, this would change their campaigns entirely. I mean, it means if they reward aggressiveness and negativity, it means they punish parties who are not doing that. And that's not an ideal situation.
No, definitely not. And it's really difficult to see, kind of open up the hood, right? And see what's going on underneath the different ranking systems and how these platforms are even calculating anger, I think is an interesting question, right? Is it a dictionary approach, machine learning? Who knows? So there's definitely some black boxes with platforms and how they work. And hopefully the Digital Services Act can help out with that. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. But first, I wanted to dive into your study on this online anti-migration campaign in Germany, where you found some really interesting dynamics of essentially the laundering of extremist ideas into mainstream political discourse. So can you set the stage a bit and tell us about the case you were looking to study and then how you went about tracing this campaign across platforms and time?
Yeah, that was really a very interesting study that took us much longer than we had anticipated, much more complicated than we had thought. And when I say we again, I have to, of course, give credit to my wonderful co-authors, Lance Bennett, Kurt Knüpfer, Franziska Martini, and Xishuan Zhang. So the UN Global Compact for Migration was a big issue. We have to time travel now, 5 years back. And basically what it was, I mean, usually those UN Global Compacts, they are criticized because they're so weak. It's usually just the smallest common denominator. Countries agree there is a problem, we should think about it. And they were very weak. There is no sanctioning potential or anything within the UN. So it was really surprising when suddenly the UN Global Compact for Migration blew up really, really big on the global, especially the European scene. And I encountered this topic when I was talking to people from the German Foreign Ministry who were basically shocked about how this topic exploded suddenly. And in their perception, it exploded when the Austrian Chancellor at that time, Sebastian Kurz, said, this UN Global Compact for Migration, we're not going to sign it. We're going to drop out, like other countries like Donald Trump and the US had before. So that was their perception. And this whole campaign against UN Global Compact was full with disinformation. Things like, if your country signs this, it's the end of the sovereignty of the state, and it will open Germany's borders, for instance, for 244 million refugees. They will all come, 244 million.
Three times the size of Germany.
Exactly, into our welfare system and all these stories. So they were like, what is this? Where is this coming from? And luckily, I was heading a research group at the Weizenbaum Institute in Berlin. We had data, we were monitoring online debates, and we thought, okay, let's find out, And this word, Migrationspakt, Migration Pact, is really easy to track because, it's a word we don't use for anything else in German. So it was really a good case study because it was sort of contained and easy to identify.
Like a German word developed specifically for this campaign.
Exactly. Because, the UN Global Compact for Migration, it's kind of long. I think it's even longer.
I have a full one here. The United Nations Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration.
Exactly. So Migrationspakt is, more on point here. So the common wisdom at that point was that mainstream debate happened after Austria left this UN Global Compact. But we sort of traced across platform, the debates that had happened before that led to that. We did some dynamic network analysis, some time series analysis, to really see what's going on here, like who's mobilizing and how does this grow. And the interesting point was, how does a total fringe topic like that was really basically something the very far-right extremist identitarian movement was mobilizing on, how does this end up in mainstream public discourse for weeks, for months? And Germany eventually signed in December 2018. But in Belgium, the government coalition broke apart over this question. So it was really, really dramatic.
So before we go further in kind of breaking down this laundering process and the role of intermediary networks, can you describe a little bit how you monitored the discussion, or kind of what was the media monitoring kind of looking like in practice?
Yeah, so for Twitter, we basically built a dynamic network analysis. It doesn't just capture one point in time, but we kind of monitored basically a retweet network for like over 6 months. We had set up a monitoring for other platforms like YouTube. We analyzed the far-right media with the Media Cloud archive on the right-wing far-right news media in Germany. So it was like kind of a more cross-platform approach. And it's difficult to compare because the data is structured just so differently. But just to see what are the networks here and how does this travel? Like who's campaigning on this with what messages and who is amplifying this and who is going to take it over? And then we basically found how the kind of low-level AfD activists, far-right media, they mobilized a little bit, but it wasn't really a big thing. It became a big thing when the identitarian movement, which is very small but very good on social media, when they started a viral campaign, Stop the Migration Pact, basically. And that was when this topic caught the attention of the German far-right populist party AfD, also their leadership. And then they basically copied this campaign. So they basically took the identitarian movement's campaign, made it their own. The logos, the websites, it all looked the same. And then kind of funneled this all into the realm of institutional politics because they are a parliamentary party and they can give parliamentary speeches about it. They started a petition in parliament, which was unusual because that's actually for groups who are not represented in the parliament. But that was very successful, and this is how it became a big topic in the mainstream.
Yeah, and I mean, when you say that they copied the campaign and the logos were similar, I mean, you even have an example in the paper where it's like the identitarian movement had like a clock, sort of doomsday clock, and then the AfD, when they had set up their webpage around this issue, it also had a doomsday clock. I mean, very unoriginal copying. And so where did this identitarian movement campaign start? Was it on YouTube? Was it on Twitter?
They started on YouTube, basically on the same day. So Martin Sellner, the leader of the identitarian movement, uploaded a video that was an instant viral hit about the Migration Pact. Like, we have to save the sovereignty of our countries, of our nations. They connected it nicely to this far-right trope of the replacement theory and, 244 million refugees. That's a lot. And at the same time, they started a YouTube account, which became big, really within days and hours. And also lots of offline stuff, like you could download stickers and posters and flyers to leave in your gym with your neighbors and all that. So it was very, very nice. They really understand the hybrid media system. So that was really interesting. And what we see here is that the identitarian movement and the AfD never really collaborated. They don't even retweet each other on a leadership level. And that is because both are under surveillance for unconstitutional activities in Germany. And the AfD, to avoid to be under this surveillance, because it means, that the state can tap your telephone and all these things, you want to avoid this as a party. Also because public servants then cannot be in your party anymore because they will lose their job, right? Because as a public servant in Germany, you cannot be part in an extremist movement or an extremist party. So if your party is labeled as that, that's a problem.
Apropos regulating parties.
Yeah, but we have very, well, in Germany, it's possible to prohibit a party, which is, we get minus points in the democracy rankings all the time for it. But this is, of course, connected to our history of genocide and Nazism. So the AfD has a list of extremist groups and they pledged to never collaborate with them. And identitarian movement was on that list. So it's like, no, they cannot openly collaborate. But they didn't have to because they had those intermediary networks of far-right media, of super spreaders, hyperactive users, and activists that basically linked their campaigns and their mobilization without the need for formal collaboration, like in a form of institutional way, have to kind of coordinate what they're doing. The structure of these discourses means they don't have to do that anymore, but they can still fight for the same thing in the same or very similar campaign.
And going back to this idea of super PACs, and this is kind of the role that they serve in the US. And so I wonder if this would be, to what extent do you think that these two groups, the identitarians and the AfD, are collaborating Yeah, of course, formally they can't, but I mean, do you think they sort of know what's going on? I know it's speculation, but at the same time, I mean, it seems that when you read the study and you sort of get one of the things I liked about it is you kind of get caught up in following the campaign as it was happening. I mean, do you think this is just a huge coincidence? It seems unlikely that it could be such a coincidence and such a copying, but then also there's no real sort of hard evidence either. So
I don't think it's a coincidence, but I don't think it's necessarily planned in secret either. It's what we've seen with many parties in many countries, this kind of link between parties and movements and how both benefit from that. See, it's like with the negativity. Parties and movements benefit from this link. We've seen it with the Republican Party and the Tea Party or the MAGA movement in the US. And similar, the AfD has had close links to the Pegida movement, this anti-Muslim movement, or the COVID denialists during the pandemic. So, they're really good at gate watching and, what kind of movements mobilize in more extreme terms, more extremely than they should be doing, don't want to be surveilled for unconstitutional activity. And they can benefit for that, kind of, as you say, outsource the more extreme, more unsavory parts of mobilizing. But I don't think it really compares to super PACs because they're very institutionalized in a way. Mm-hmm. So this is much less institutionalized. It's just like partners in crime, they have something to offer each other. For the parties, they benefit from it. For the movements, they get access to resources and to institutionalized politics, which is really good, as a small movement like the Identitarians, who are said to have only 400 people, very media savvy people. But it's actually very small. And suddenly they get the help of this party in parliament to really take their issues and their campaign to a whole different level and give them access and the attention of the mainstream.
Yeah. And there's this cool, as you mentioned, you have this dynamic network graph that you can view on YouTube.
A blockbuster
video, and it was really cool. You can sort of see you see these sort of different factions sort of coming into the network. But unfortunately, academic publishing is not the space where you can have a dynamic network video modeled.
Not yet.
Not yet. I'll have to figure that one out in terms of how it shows when you're printing it. But just a curiosity from my side, this video you mentioned that the Identitarians uploaded, was it one of these like explainer animated videos?
No, it was just basically Martin Sellner sitting there and explaining everything. Hey, here's something that's happening. You need to watch it. Yeah, and we can't watch it anymore because YouTube deleted it.
So it won't be in the show notes.
They didn't just delete this video; they deleted Martin Sellner's account, which of course is something that we think is a good, deleting extremist content on one hand is a good thing. On the other hand, it's not there for research anymore.
Yeah.
And you can't download and save everything just to be sure that it's still there when you publish papers.
Yeah, I'm just curious because these so maybe it wasn't animated, but it was still an explainer video, and that uploading of explainer videos to YouTube and then putting them onto Facebook or Twitter is something that you see on the far right in the US. There was this Brexit video that went viral, and so I think when you're doing this type of research, that cross-platform aspect is so crucial to, and especially YouTube. I think that's where a lot of the things get seeded and then they start going.
It really had this kind of influencer look. So he's really good at that. So like he would do also, not with this video, but he would also post videos where he cooks something and then explains, the good Austrian food, potatoes. I think they come from South America, but, okay. And he's married to this American Brittany Pettibone, now Brittany Pettibone Sellner, who's like one of those female very visible far-right influencers. So it's sort of this kind of young, cool, influencery video that he did.
Although, and I'm going to anger some Austrian listeners, Austrian cooking videos would not be the cuisine that I would particularly enjoy or pick watching. Although I do enjoy the Bachhandel.
But it's when they combine like makeup tutorials with extremist content or stuff that really comes low threshold. It's just, it's just about cooking. He's at home, but it's kind of the extremist content sales on that.
Well, let's dive into, now that we're sort of coming towards the end of the episode, where only the hardcore listeners keep on, and talk about some work you've been doing in the context of the Digital Services Act. Because, I mean, even I think in both studies we discussed, you're very transparent, and the data quality is it is what it is, right? You can't look and see what the Facebook algorithm's doing. In the Migration Pact study, you were limited by the representativity of Twitter data, right? You're modeling networks based on not full data set, which is a problem that all researchers are hitting. So can you describe a bit the work you've been doing with Dr. Jakob Ohme on basically trying to inform, or this is how I would interpret it, trying to inform policymakers about the types of data access that researchers need to study democracy, but also potentially what's actually feasible to work with. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Because there's all sorts of things, all sorts of policy lingo, like DSCs and VSEs. And so it's
It's confusing. Yeah, it's very new to us as well. So we have a very bad situation concerning data access, and it's always been bad, but it's gone from bad to worse. Now even the Twitter API is closed.
Just today, as we record this.
Yeah, and Jakob Ohme, with whom I'm running this little initiative, he found this really nice metaphor of saying it's like we were medical researchers wanting to find out more about the human body. We just don't have access to one. And of course, this is overly dramatic, but I think it kind of nails it. So what can we actually do? And sometimes regulation really can help. And the DSA, the Digital Services Act, is one such example. So the EU passed the Digital Services Act, and it's going to go in effect next year in February. So what's happening now is that it went back to the national governments in Europe, who now kind of have to find national laws to implement all of this. So there's one article in the DSA, the Digital Services Act, and it kind of obliges platforms to give vetted researchers access to platform data in the context of doing research on systematic risks, right? So this is already a law. Now it has to be implemented. And the question is, how do we do this? Like, how do our governments know what kind of data we want? Do they know what APIs are? Do we want APIs, or do we want more archives, like a cross-platform CrowdTangle? Do we need something like data clean rooms for more sensitive issues? Do we even know what kind of data is there that we could request? So the way this will go, if it goes into effect, is that each country in Europe has a digital service coordinator, and vetted scholars, basically you send a data access request to your national coordinator, who will do the vetting process and then demand the data from the platform. So you don't yourself, you have no interaction with the platforms directly, but the platforms then give you the data directly. You do either go through your national coordinator or through the coordinator where the platform sits, which is Ireland. So the Irish DSC is going to be really crucial. And there's also this risk that we kind of cram this channel with hundreds and thousands of data access requests, and they just can't handle it. Mm-hmm. So at this point, I was just asking, who of us is involved in this? I think this is the point where we should consult the governments and kind of let them know what kind of data we want, in which formats, and so forth. It's a huge, huge chance, but only if we get this right. If we get this right, we will have an institutionalized way to get access. And there are so many open questions right now. For instance, what about a right to scrape? Wouldn't that be great to have this in the regulation? What about data donations and their legitimacy? So it's a really big chance that we have right now, but we have to get involved and try to be very useful to the coordinators in our individual countries.
Yeah, I think this kind of concentration around Ireland has also been a problem with the GDPR as well, with a DPO, Data Protection Officer, instead of a DSC. So these policy documents are, this is how the the mechanics and the functioning of things moves along, right? So there'll be a link in the episode description to the document where you respond directly to the questions that DG Connect is asking for.
So it's a very different genre than from the text we usually write. So what this is basically the European Commission asked some questions to researchers to respond to. We had very short time to respond, what came very surprisingly at that point in May. I think they received 130 something responses. I don't know how they will work through all of this. We are also writing a policy paper. We had a series of workshops with lots of colleagues, also more interdisciplinary, and also colleagues, researchers from NGOs in Germany. So we're writing a policy paper for the German DSC, the German government on this, and we will probably have more workshops in fall and winter to discuss how those data access requests will actually work. And what is with our American colleagues? Does it work for them too? Can we only study questions that pertain to the European Union? So many things are open right now, but at the same time, this process of lawmaking moves, and it moves quickly. And if we only have answers on what we want and how next year, this window of opportunity has passed. So this is something I think all people who work with platform data or want to work with platform data should get involved now.
Definitely. And I think it's probably a 10, 12-page policy document, but what would you say are the guiding kind of principles that you think are crucial that should be in this DSA?
What I think is crucial, and I don't know if it's so crucial in that paper because we're basically answering the questions that the European Commission had. What is crucial, there's Article 40 on data access, and within Article 40 there is one part, number 12, it's like Article 12 in Article 40, and that is about publicly available data. And I think 90% of the data we need to work with, relate to that. And basically Article 12 in Article 40 stipulates that this has to be made available to researchers like immediately and in real time, which I think says API, because how else would you do it? So I think this is really the big chance. And my fear is that the platforms will focus on the most complicated cases with the most sensitive data and privacy regulations and all that. But I'm really happy that there is Article 12 in Article 40. And I think this needs to have priority, because if this gets priority, we will get data on publicly available data, like what parties post, for instance, really quickly and really easily.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Once this DSA shakes out, and maybe who knows if there's court challenges or whatever, if we do get new types of data, then we can study new types of things. But it may just be that we, for example, just have the type of data that we have gotten before just enshrined into law. So it could fundamentally change the type of research that's being done. So it's definitely an interesting space to watch, and great that you and Jakob and others are working directly with governments to try to figure out some of these important issues that helps us do our job. So Professor...
That's what we hope.
So Professor Klinger, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your research with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It was fun. A lot of fun.
I've just been speaking with Professor Ulrike Klinger, Professor for Digital Democracy at the European New School of Digital Studies, European University Viadrina. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Just a heads up that I'm going to be on summer break for the next month, so there won't be an episode coming out then, although you're probably used to that by now. But I already have some plans for what to cover when I get back, so look out for episodes dropping in August. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Melbourne. See you next time, and have a wonderful summer.